Well, good morning. Let's conclude our study of 10 hurdles to studying theology. This study has come from the first 15 pages of Sproul's Essential Truths of the Christian Faith. This is one of the covers. It's been reprinted multiple times. This is the last copy I have currently, but if you want this one, you're welcome to it for $5 to cover the cost that we got that. And if you want a copy and need me to order it, I'd be happy to do that as well. A lot more in there beyond this introductory material. We've considered 9 of the hurdles to studying theology. I want to review those to get them in your mind, and then the 10th one will, in some ways, encapsulate all of them. If you have any comments along the way, if it rings a bell, shoot your hand up and we'll try to glean from your input as well. Hurdle number 1 was the error of childlike faith. Childlike faith. The real danger there was not childlike faith, because that was the contention. If I get into theology, I'll lose this kind of childlike embrace of Christ. Well, what we saw was that the real danger is childish faith. Our faith in Jesus should be childlike. It should be simple trust in what he says, what he asks us to do. However, the Bible calls us to doctrinal maturity. It doesn't want us to stay in the place of childish faith. So we trust like a child, but in a sense we study like a scholar, in some way demonstrating maturity. So the error of childlike faith can be the first hurdle as we're running towards theology. Number 2, a fear of theological skepticism. The thought is that by studying theology, it will lead us to this faithless intellectualism. It'll be all about facts and knowledge and more and more and more, and we'll lose the personal side. Well, certainly that is a potential pitfall, but we can't let it keep us from pursuing the knowledge of God in his word. We have to ask ourselves, is that really God's design for his revelation? Did he give us his word? Did he reveal himself to us so that we would be confused and deceived into thinking intellectual knowledge and facts are the sum total? And of course, that's not true. As a matter of fact, when Jesus was tempted with the devil's bad theology in his temptation in the wilderness, his answer was good theology, getting it right, going back to exactly what God had said in the Word. And so we can't let the fear of what we see in some people, perhaps, that intellectualism, keep us from engaging the intellect in the pursuit of knowing God. Number 3, the error of easy believism. Easy believism discourages the further study of God, in a sense claiming to, all I need to know is that Jesus has saved me. I'm good. I'm saved. I'm going to heaven, and that's good enough for me. Well, that mindset could be a hurdle. It discourages the further study of God. But the truth is, when we're saved by Jesus, he is, yes, the rescuer, the Savior, but he's also Lord and Master, and he says to us, come, follow me. And so we hear the Lord say that, and we study him, we follow him, we imitate him. The idea of easy should be erased from our minds. While we can be at rest in the pursuit of Jesus, while he is our rest when we come to him, he tells us, we need to remember that following him may indeed be difficult. Number 4, the error of neo-monasticism, the idea of monastery, a monk, a nun, somebody who retreats from the world to that place of isolation to pursue holiness. This is the error of avoiding the world. If we pull out of the world and think that's what will make us clean, then we won't rely on the sanctifying power of the Word. Jesus, in his high priestly prayer in John 17 prays to the Father that the Father would sanctify the disciples, and that sanctification process would happen by the Word. Now, we would see from even the prayer and elsewhere that that's the Spirit and the Word. But Jesus says, I'm not asking, Father, that you take them out of the world. I'm sending them into the world, and so sanctify them. The idea is not that we retreat from the world, but rather we retreat to the Word, which will keep us living rightly in the world. God hasn't taken us out of the world in order to keep us clean. Instead, He gave us His Word. And so the psalmist would pray, your Word have I hid in my heart that I might not sin. Well, if that is true in that simple equation, your Word has been hidden in my heart. We could borrow Romans 12 and said it's renewed my mind so that I won't sin. When we work it backwards, we pretty much have a reason for why we sin, why we lose our temper, why we're covetous, why we're fearful. Fill in the blank. But it's going to be rooted back to somehow there was a neglect of the Word. We set it aside. We didn't heed it. When David sinned with Bathsheba, I can assure you it wasn't because he didn't know who God was, didn't know what God expected, but somehow he was able to set it aside, to forget it, to neglect it. And because it wasn't actively working on his mind, it wasn't keeping him from sin. And so let the Word sanctify you today and throughout this week. Study. Be a theologian in order to shine as light in a dark world. Number 5, the fear of controversies. Because we think controversy accompanies theological conviction, we think maybe we shouldn't be so convictional about theology. That way we won't get into controversies. The example of Jesus and his disciples, though, reminds us that they stirred up plenty of theological controversy. They couldn't even walk through a field and nibble on some wheat without stirring up controversy. So just be reminded that that's not theology's fault in the sense of theology is bad. It's disunifying. Quite the contrary. It unifies us in the only way that is absolutely essential. Ephesians 4, one faith, one Lord, one baptism, one Spirit. The oneness, the unity comes in good theology. So Jude reminds us in Jude 3 to contend for the faith once delivered to the saints. Figure out what has united the saints all throughout humanity and cling to that. Now, we'll realize that's going to get us to the core. There's going to be other stuff that saints have kind of held on to, but maybe bickered about over the years. But there is a core faith that is handed down, and that's where we should be willing to be contentious because of the truth. And again, we know our manner should be that of love. It should be a sweet spirit. It should be with kind motives, with concern, even for the antagonist. But the reality is, Jesus said he came to bring a sword. And that sword would divide even parent from child and husband from wife because truth divides. And that we have to trust God with. So we'll contend for the faith. We'll study to know God and His Word. And as that is divisive in some ways, and that may be painful at times, we have to accept it, that that's the work of God's truth. Number 6, the anti-rational spirit of the age can be a hurdle. We have to be careful here not to over-contrast head knowledge and what we call heart knowledge. The idea of facts are the head, but devotion or personality or just personal relationship is heart. Don't set them against each other. God designed us with the ability to both love and treasure Him as well as to reason and think. They're not enemies. They work together and they actually feed each other. Because we can read God's words to us and put them together and think them through, we can better understand His love for us, and it helps us love Him. But as we love Him more, we want to know Him more, and that's going to send us to the Word, and round it'll go. but don't pit them against each other as if head knowledge and heart knowledge are different. They're not. So let them serve each other. Number 7, the seduction of worldliness. Here specifically, we are talking about intellectual worldliness, which abandons truth by allowing anything to be true. We call it relativism. So what's true for you may not be true for me. Hey, if you want to believe that, that's fine, and hopefully that helps you and that works for you, but that's just not for me. And that kind of relativism is seductive because it makes me in charge. Relativism is the thinking pattern of humanism. Man is at the top, and specifically me, I am at the top, and I do what I want. I call the shots. And the script was handed to Adam and Eve in the garden by the devil. Has God really said? Is he really going to do that? Is he holding back on you? You should be in charge. If you eat of the fruit, you'll know good and evil. You'll make the decisions. And it appealed to self. And the thinking began that, hey, well, God said it, but what's true to me? And they stepped out on that plank of truth to me, and it couldn't hold. It never will. So beware of the seduction of rationalism. As you study the Bible, study it as truth, not truth to you. Don't share the word with people and say something like, well, I think this means that. No, God has spoken, and it really doesn't matter what you think it means, or it's not truth to you, it's truth. Whether you accept it or not, it's true. That's how we come to the Bible. It's not truth if you believe it, it's absolute truth. And just know that absolute truth is becoming more and more the enemy of our culture. It's been the case all along, but certainly in our once Judeo-Christian nation, where we had the expectation of truth meaning something, whether that was biological truth, whether that was, chemical, physical truth, whether that was historical truth, religious or biblical truth. All of that now is up for grabs. And it's going to be harder and harder for you to tiptoe into spiritual conversations and then hope that, your stand for truth will trump everyone's thinking. When frankly, most of the people you'll talk to now, other than, the gray-headed generation, most of them, they don't really care what you're claiming to be is true. Because they've been raised that it's all about them. Whatever they want to believe is true, that's good enough. And with that voice of the world saying, well, what's true for you, it isn't for me, is loud. And so our evangelism, our witness is going to have to be equally as bold. They're aggressive with their strategy, saying there is no truth. You're going to have to more and more stand on truth. When they praise your children, or when they see your good neighboring or your good work in the workplace, it's going to have to be because God's truth calls me to live this way. And you start making it known that there is an absolute standard that dictates how you live. Because anything else, anything less than God tells me in His Word how to live, anything else will just be perceived as, whatever works for you. That, I'm willing to kind of embezzle and cheat and steal for my boss, so great, you're a good employee in some other way. Everybody's going to have their own, and they won't recognize you as anything different than just your own sphere unless you start pulling God into the conversation. Number 8, the hurdle of laziness. We must do the hard work of pursuing the knowledge of God. Peter spoke of Paul's writings at times being hard to understand. And because it was hard to understand, some will abandon the pursuit and will twist the scriptures to their own destruction. They'll be content with the lazy approach, and if I can't figure it out, I won't even try, and I'll just make it mean whatever I want, and that never ends well. So do the hard work. And again, if we'll link this word theology to something that maybe strikes us as more personal, instead of just studying theology, it would be actually caring that God revealed himself to you. You care to know God in the way that he's revealed himself. Now it's not, oh, I better go to the library and get a book and study it and look up the big words in a dictionary. Now it's, no, I want to know this God that is telling me how to live every day and that I'm claiming to want to live for every day. Don't let laziness keep us from being better students, better disciples of God. Study and love God with all your mind. Those all words can be convicting because we give ourselves to a lot of things to figure it out, to know how it works so that we can do better in that area. Well, if you want to do better in your marriage, if you want to do better at your parenting and grandparenting, you want to do better at loving one another in the church, then do the hard work of seeing how God shows us how that's possible. Not only tells us how to do it, but he shows us how it's possible. Number 9, the substitution of devotion for study. In this hurdle, we challenged ourselves not to settle for just short, not to settle for shallow, not to take the path of least resistance. And we tried to walk this fine line of not discouraging some that have very little time, energy, and if a short devotional guide can help you, great. Make sure it ties you to the Word and not just somebody's thoughts. So we didn't want to discourage. However, we also want to be mindful of the previous hurdle that we just climbed over, that hurdle of laziness, and we don't want to take the easy way out. So don't substitute an easy nugget handed to you for the pick and the shovel and heading into the mine and doing it yourself sometimes. And I think one of the steps of maturity in our study would be, maybe we're doing the devotional study, but does that devotional study entice us to learn to do this on our own? We talked about that a little. Is it teaching you how to do this? So if you didn't buy that book or use it next year, you could just open your Bible and begin doing that on your own. Somehow we have to make sure, again, kind of like head and heart aren't competing with each other, neither should devotion and study. They should fuel each other. We should want to know more. So don't miss the meat of the Word because we were snacking on comfort foods, all right? Dive in, both study, hard work of study, and devotion are both worship and are both disciplines of the Christian life. Number 10, again, a generic summary perhaps of the other 9. And by generic, I don't mean at all unimportant, because I think rightfully Sproul has said hurdle number 10, kind of representing the other 9 as we've tried to climb over, and we come face to face with the fact that if we're not studying the Bible, we may just simply be disobedient. So he lists disobedience as the 10th hurdle. And I think it is helpful to hear it put this way, because a lot of the other hurdles we can say, oh, I've never really thought that. That one doesn't apply to me. Or maybe I've overcome that one. And then we just come down to the harsh reality of disobedience. It is disobedience to remain a weak or a poor theologian. A lot of times people will just hide behind the idea theology is hard to understand, and so they'll simply say, well, I don't know. That stuff's beyond me. And somewhere in there, it may simply be they came to this hurdle and they've never climbed over the hurdle of disobedience. They're just refusing to try to keep praying and wrestling with the Scriptures to understand God. It is disobedience to remain a poor theologian. Or to put it another way, it is disobedience to ignore God's plan to help you live right. And then to bemoan the fact that things aren't going well. And you can't figure out why you're always at odds with your spouse, and you can't figure out why you're always losing your temper, and you can't figure out why you always talk to your accountability partner and you blew it again, and there's frustration as if this is all God's problem. If he would take away these desires, I wouldn't do. No, it is disobedience to give so little attention to the discipleship manual we've been handed. It's the same folly of the stereotypical Christmas morning when the child opens their gifts and dad decides to help them put it together, and as they're tearing through the box, they throw the directions, into the pile of wrapping paper because they can figure it out on their own. Then they realize with 98 pieces and all the connectors and all that, they have no idea how this works out, and everyone's frustrated, and it's because they didn't follow the manual. Further, we could say it's disobedience to just not care very much in the course of the week to know what God chose to reveal once for all humanity. So comprehensive and complete and perfect that he says in Peter's letters, everything we need for life and godliness is here in the precious promises. I think we'd have to conclude it's disobedience to think it's just not important enough for me to look into in the course of the week. For the Christian, I think we must see the study of God, the desire to know him, theology, as both a duty and a delight. For the Christian, it is your duty to know God. I want to just point out Deuteronomy chapter 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. Like it or not, you're to love the Lord with all your heart. You say, well, no, that doesn't work that way. Like I'm supposed to feel it. I just got to be in the mood, right? Like some kind of Valentine's Day romance or something. But all that language of love comes to us in these imperatives. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. These words I command you shall be on your heart. It is your duty to know God and his revelation to us. And you're not doing your duty if you're not growing in your knowledge of him or becoming a better theologian. We don't like to take the word duty and slap it on the Christian life because we feel like, well, isn't that whole legalism thing? I thought Christianity was supposed to be, I love the Lord and I just want to always do what he wants me to do. Praise the Lord for those days where you wake up and you're just thriving on doing right and walking with the Lord, and it's if you woke up and the Spirit whispered into your heart, if you love me, keep my commandments aren't grievous, and you just dove into the day and obedience was easy. But we all know that there's plenty of times when obedience isn't easy. And a soft answer that would turn away wrath is like chewing on a mouthful of gravel. Like it does not feel soft. It feels like you're about to bite a firecracker. We know that obedience isn't always the very tip-top feeling in our heart, and we just can't wait. Anything that comes out, it's always going to overflow in obedience. Not always. So don't be afraid of pulling in the duty of loving God with all your heart, soul, and might. It'll remind us what love really is. It's not just a human feeling. It's not just a response to some stimulus. I ate good pizza, I love it. No, that's how our idea of love has gotten so convoluted. And we've missed out on the fact that love can be action more than even reaction. It can be a choice that says, I set my desire, my affection on something. Or I choose to do this. Duty. And suddenly obeying here what God has said becomes this act of worship. So don't be afraid of duty. Love the Lord is the command. These words shall be on your heart. Ecclesiastes 12. After you read through the wisdom of Proverbs, and then we think about who Solomon is and when he went through, and we wrestle with Ecclesiastes and the unique arguments that are there, he gets to the end and he says, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Not the whole loving response, not the whole feeling of, oh, I delight in him. I think that'll come. Whether it comes first or comes second with duty, it'll come. But hear this, whether you feel like it or not this week, your duty is to fear God and keep his commandments. So for the Christian, it's our duty to know God as theologians. But for the Christian, it should also be our delight. You could read often in the Psalms, most succinctly, Psalm 119, verse 16, where the psalmist says, I will delight in your word. Why is that? What is it about Deuteronomy? What is it about 1 Kings? What is it about Daniel? What is it about Mark? What is it about 1 Peter that you'd say, oh, I love this paragraph? You know, it's not the way it was written, the grammar. There's something being communicated to the soul of one who has the Holy Spirit in them where that truth resonates. And we realize I am learning more about God. His words are on the page. He has spoken to me. That's why the psalmist say, I would delight in your word. It wasn't he was saying, I have a choice here between the written word and maybe communion with God somehow, and I'm choosing the word. I delight in the word. No, he's saying the word is the path to God. So I delight in your word. Paul, not contradicting the psalmist who said, I delight in your word, Paul in Philippians 3 says, I want to know Christ. I want to know him. No matter what it costs, I want to know him. He had already cashed in all of his credentials as a religious leader of the church, and he said, it doesn't mean anything. All that is empty and worthless. He counts it as the scrap heap, the dunghill. It's that worthless compared to actually knowing God in person through the Word. And so it's a delight as well as a duty. And I think the idea of obedience will have both duty and delight. Because face it, as a husband or a wife, God gives you commands on how to treat each other. And if we just camp on one of them, the big idea of love one another, you realize your spouse isn't always generating in you a natural response of flowery, happy feelings of love. But you've obeyed out of duty and you've loved. And other times it's really easy. And it does come so naturally that you don't even engage your mind on the spiritual action of obeying God and loving your spouse. You did it and you weren't thinking, you know what, this is what I need to do. No, it just happened. Why? Because it was a delight. And both of them kind of mesh into this worship of obedience. The duty and delight of obedience. And it should be our response to the word. We've looked at it before, but over in chapter 29 of Deuteronomy, verse 29, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law. The secret things belong to the Lord, all right? So we're already distinguished. We will never be what God is. You'll have a resurrected body and all kinds of perfections, and you will still never be what God is. You'll never be infinite in your knowledge. You'll never know everything God knows. We'll know much more. We'll figure out a whole lot of things in heaven, but we will never be God. That's not our destiny that, oh, once we get to heaven and we're made perfect, we'll be just like God. No, never going to happen. He will always be something other than we are. So the secret things belong to him. However, contrast, but the things that are revealed belong to us. Now, will every one of us equally feel that belonging? Probably not. Not every mind computes the same and digests the same and understands the same and at the same tempo and at the same depth. So you might have a better grasp on some area of the Christian life than someone else, but that's okay. That's why we're all in this together. That's why we exhort one another. That's why we submit to one another so that when someone says, hey, I think you might be off on this, you hear that and you receive it. So we're not saying everybody's the same here, but we are saying everybody's under the same weight of responsibility that no one can say, oh, that's just not for me. I'm just not a theologian. Remember our original premise. Everyone's a theologian. You're either a good one or a bad one. Either a lazy one or a diligent one. Either a stagnant one or a growing one. And you could go through the hurdles and think it through and you realize, I can't settle for the category of some are theologians and some aren't. No, I've got to come back to my responsibility to know God. And here in Deuteronomy 29, he's made it a command, and he said, I've revealed things to you as a gift. They belong to you. With the gifts under the tree that we have at Christmas, the kids come down and they're looking for their name on the package because they know it belongs to them. And here God said, these words belong to you. Now, granted, they belong to everyone else too, but that doesn't take away the personal sense that this is for me, belongs to me. And then we're told why with that word that. The things that are revealed belong to us, that, or so that we may do all the words of this law. Obedience, doing. James, I'm sure, knew Deuteronomy, and he talked about doing. He liked that idea of doing because maybe he had experienced, and he certainly knew other Christians did as well, that we're real good at hearing. We come to church and hear, in Sunday school, equip hour, we hear the message, we listen to the radio perhaps, we listen to Christian music. We do lots of hearing. And frankly, if you measured up all your hearing, would it rightly correlate to our measure of maturity? James is saying the danger is it doesn't. The danger is there are people that have been hearing for 40 years in the church and their growth is pretty small in comparison. Writer of Hebrews warned us of that. Some of you by now, a lot of hearing, should be further along. You should be teachers. You should have heard so much and so well and digested it that now you're dispensing it to others. But instead, you're still barely hearing. Don't be just hearers of the word, but be doers of it. So don't think of being a theologian or a student of God as just studying and knowing, but it's knowing for a purpose. These things belong to me now so that I might do. In other words, sound theology is the hope of a sound life. These things belong to us so that we might do. Now that doing isn't just like don't murder, don't lust, don't covet. It's also, no, love God with all your heart. Love your spouse. Bring your children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. It's a lot of good stuff. So don't think even the doing is all these, routines and drudgeries of the week. No, it's all the good that's there. That God says leads to the joy in life because we're doing it God's way. Sound theology is the hope of a sound life. Do what he says. We go back to Eden again and again to see the contrast. Bad theology, how does that end up in life? Not even a full generation, just their children kill each other off. That's how quickly life goes wrong when bad theology takes root. When we question God's goodness and think, I know better, and out of the garden they go, and a decade or two later, they're burying one of their sons killed by the other. Bad theology does not produce good living, a sound life. Sound theology, when God reveals himself, those things belong to us so that we can do what he said. And so you have to wonder, when you sin, in your confession, could you go back and figure out what went wrong? Adam and Eve, when they looked back over their shoulders and saw that angel standing there with a flaming sword, reminding them, you're not coming back into the sweet fellowship with the Lord because you're sinful. They would have been able to think pretty clearly of what went wrong. I don't think they ever forgot that encounter with a talking serpent who told them that God wasn't good. They could easily trace their sin back to, oh, there's where I missed it. So as you think back on your sin of this week, this past week, try to figure out, what did I miss about the character of God that would have kept me from sin? And let's bury that deep in our hearts. Let's make whatever we missed, take that theology and let it renew our minds. Let's stop doubting that God isn't good to us so that we can do what he says. And with that word hidden in our hearts, we might not commit that same sin this week. Sound theology is the hope of a sound life. So don't let these hurdles trip you up. God is worth knowing. So love him with all of your mind. Whatever else you do with all your mind this week, make sure you're loving God. You might think with all your mind, you've got to figure out how to deal with this child who's lately been giving you fits. Or you got to figure out if this is going to work in the workplace with this boss. There's this conflict and it's not being resolved. So you're consumed by it. And we know what it is to have our minds occupied with something that's really important. Well, God's command to us is, listen, I'm really important and I want you to love me with all of your mind. So plow through the hurdles. Maybe you've seen runners do that in those Olympic races. Climb over them, but don't let them keep you from the knowledge of God. Paul in Philippians 3, having said he wants to know Christ, then gives us that well-known text of, I press toward the mark. Sproul doesn't cite that verse specifically, but I'm wondering if in his mind that's where he got this idea of hurdle. Running full speed and now needing the energy to jump over a hurdle and then running and there's another one. And it's a constant press. You got to keep going to reach the finish line because the hurdles will always be there. You can't say today, I've made it over all the hurdles. I'm going to keep on studying because the devil's just going to take one from before and bring it back to the front of the line. When you run the 110-meter hurdle race, you only have so many to get over, but the devil's going to keep bringing them to the front, and you're just going to have to keep going over them. Don't let anything keep you from pursuing the God who saved you. He's revealed himself to you. So know him. And so, Lord, make us faithful students. And while that word could be academic, by that we mean we sit at your feet like you invited both Mary and Martha to do. And we neglect some of the busyness. That's not bad stuff, but we just know what's most important to set our hearts like a compass on the direction that is good and right. You help us to embrace duty and delight today, on this your day where our minds can be refreshed and renewed, and then each moment throughout the week when we can do that on some small scale. We do believe you are worth knowing, serving, and living for. And so, by your grace, make us faithful this week to do what we ought as we see it in the truth of your word. We ask this in Jesus' name.